Hello, genealogists. This is Craig, and this is Just Genealogy. And we continue the reading of Genealogy as Pastime and Profession by Donald Lyons Jacobus with Chapter 3, Family Pride. It begins with a quote, "Love covers a multitude of sins," and Paul said that. And then another quote, "Whatever folly men commit by their shortcomings or their vices, what they may, let us exercise forbearance, remembering that when these faults appear in others, it is our follies and vices that we behold. They are the shortcomings of humanity, to which we belong, whose faults, one and all, we share." Schopenhauer. The first chapter of the Gospel of Matthew professes to set forth in 42 generations the descent of Jesus from Abraham. Like most Asiatic pedigrees, it is concerned with the male line of descent, to the neglect of the spindle side. Nevertheless, 4 of the wives in the pedigree are singled out for mention. Surprisingly, the good old matriarchs, Sarah and Rebekah and Leah, are passed over in silence. The 4 honored by mention are Tamar, who played the harlot, with Judah, Rahab, who not only had been a harlot, but, what was nearly as bad in the eyes of the Jews, was a Gentile by birth, Ruth, who was also a Gentile, and Bathsheba, who committed adultery with King David. The ancestry of Jesus is not impeccable, and the biographer Matthew even went out of his way to specify the descent from 4 women who, judged by the canons of the time, were of dubious repute. It ill becomes us lesser mortals, then, to insist that our own ancestry should exhibit none but perfect characters. Yet such is human vanity that most of us, when we begin to shiny up the family tree, have our eyes fixed on the luscious fruit of governors, noted clergymen, or military heroes. It is disconcerting to our pride if we find we have picked a wormy apple. A genealogist told me 60 years ago of a client who bragged that she was the 6th cousin of a governor and had the relationship charted on her pedigree book, but had never heard of her second cousin in the poorhouse. There is no need to worry if we find that an ancestor here or there was a shady character. Biologists tell us that if our parents and grandparents were reasonably decent people, so far as heredity is concerned, we need not worry about the deviations from rectitude of more remote ancestors. Nature prefers the straight line of normality or mediocrity, and with new blood brought in by successive marriages in each generation, the tendency is always to lower the up curve of genius or to raise the down curve of degenerative traits, and thus to bring both back closer to the norm. Today, an adult of early colonial descent on all lines may have 10 or more generations behind them in this country, involving 1,000 or so individual ancestors. It is unreasonable to suppose that all of this larger number will prove to have been superior in character and ability. Stand on the busiest corner of New York City and detain the first 500 people who pass either on foot or in a variety of vehicles, and line them up and look them over. Say that they roughly correspond, person for person, with each of our first American ancestors, and we shall not be far wrong. There will be, most likely, a very few of exceptional ability, and a very few scoundrels. The great majority will be passably good citizens, mediocre and commonplace. If it be objected that many of these hypothetically drawn into our net on the metropolitan corner may be foreigners, the obvious reply is that every single one of our first colonial ancestors was a foreigner. Family pride may be the motive that first attracts us to genealogical studies. If we progress far enough, this pride is bound to suffer one or more jolts when we discover that we had ancestors with whom, belike we ourselves, would not care to associate intimately. Then, if we retain our interest despite our wounded pride and persevere in our genealogical studies, the time comes when we view these matters in better perspective, and we discover that we have gained something in cultural experience. One of the hardest problems that a professional genealogist has to solve is the attitude he should take when he finds the wormy apple in a client's family tree. A mere murder can be passed over in silence. If an ancestor was hanged, the date of death can be given without specifying the cause. Doubtless, it is wiser from a mercenary point of view to withhold unpalatable facts from a client, where this can be done without falsifying records. A family history published in 1961 does indeed state correctly the date and place of death of a member of the family, but without revealing the under an assumed name he was the greatest mass murderer known to American criminal history, or that he was executed on the date specified. But let us suppose that the problem given to the genealogist to solve is the parentage of one Jane Robinson, born about 1720. After diligent search in the record sources of the proper time and place, the genealogist, from a careful placing together of evidence from court, probate, and church records, proves that Jane was an illegitimate child. He has solved the problem despite the difficulties involved, and as he takes a pardonable pride in his honest, diligent work, his impulse is to crow over his success and report the findings to his client. But will the client be equally pleased with his success? Usually not. The genealogist, if conscientious, will not even consider falsifying the facts as the records disclose them. Two courses of action are open to him. He can lie and tell his client that he has failed to solve the problem, or he can be apologetic and report the truth. There are objections to the first course, quite aside from the genealogist's disinclination to be forced into a lie. The client may conclude that he did not cover the records thoroughly, and in time may engage some other genealogist on the same problem, paying out money needlessly for a mere duplication of work already done. Only once I have personally withheld results from a client in such circumstances, and although I still feel it was justified, in doing so, my lie did not accomplish its object in the end. The client, a long since deceased, wanted her maternal line traced. I traced it, and in doing so, discovered that my client's mother was born out of wedlock. It was quite a romantic story, and the actual grandparents were finally married some 40 years after the birth of their child, and only a year or so before the granddaughter, my client, was born. Being the baby of the family, she had been kept in ignorance of the story, and no outsider had chanced to enlighten her. She had married well and occupied a fine social position. Feeling it would be cruel to reveal the facts, I gave the grandparents as married, but omitted the damaging date. 12 years later, she came to me again. She wanted to join a society to which many of her friends belonged, and one of them, who did a little research occasionally for the amusement of it, had told her that it ought to be possible to locate the marriage record of her grandparents. I knew that it was recorded in the very town where one would naturally expect to find it, only a few miles from where my client lived. It would have been a terrible blow to her to have this discovery made by this friend. Women are sometimes catty, even in the best social circles. So I warned her to drop the matter, and as gently as possible explained why I gave this advice, and thus my amiable lie of a dozen years before was thwarted in its purpose. Although intemperance in the use of alcoholic beverages was frowned upon as a vice by our colonial forefathers, indulgence which they considered temperate might be considered excessive today. The quantity of grog consumed by a college president at taverns when traveling would paralyze your hardiest contemporary drinkers. The following episode is from an unpublished diary, child of J.S., died September 24, 1773, their foolishness in making great wedding ye night before. Both got drunk, ye father and mother. It is supposed they lay on it, and it killed it in their drunkenness. A numerous company of wedding dingers At night, but one of ye whole company attended ye funeral. Shame. The parents by no means belonged to the lower grades of society, and they had sufficient means to give a big wedding party. After 1800, temperance societies began to flourish. During the early years of that century, the minister of a parish on the coast, the inhabitants of which were largely seafarers, filled the parish burial register with the names who fell victims to the demon rum. Within the space of a decade and a half, he listed the following causes of death: hurt in a tavern and fell down the stairs drunk, rum, drunkard, a pauper, an old drunkard, intoxicated, delirium tremens, a youth of 24 years, dead in a ditch, intemperance, several merely intemperance, 2 others delirium tremors, and 2 suicides. Small wonder that the printed copy omits nearly a third of the stated causes of death, or that the present custodian dislikes to have the original record examined. For those unfortunates were members of the good old families of the village. One of them was a daughter-in-law of the former minister. It is not difficult to understand why many of the old church records have disappeared. Although illegitimate records were fairly common in New England in colonial days, and considerable laxity prevailed among the unmarried youths and maidens, marital infidelity was rare. Nevertheless, divorce was not infrequent, the husband being the usual offender. The most common cause of divorce was desertion by the husband, sometimes accompanied by infidelity on his part, and several instances have been found of the husband leaving his wife and going to a distant town, where he married a second time without the formality of a divorce. Seemingly insoluble genealogical problems sometimes owe their origin to such extra-legal alliances. Marriage was not a sacrament, but a civil contract in the eyes of the Puritans. In the earlier days, all of their ceremonies were performed by the civil magistrates. Those unacquainted with Puritan custom may easily draw erroneous deductions from the fact that an ancestor was married by the governor. People had to be married by the governor or one of the lesser magistrates, and erring young couples who were compelled to marry by court order sometimes had a knot tied by the governor himself, so no special distinction attached to his officiating. In Revolutionary times, a young husband who was in the service failed to return to his family. The statutory period for desertion having passed, the wife secured a divorce, married again, and had a child with a second husband before her first Romeo appeared on the scene again. This Enoch Arden, in real life, did not care to fade out of the picture. He petitioned the legislature to set aside the divorce on the ground that he had been prevented from returning sooner to his family by circumstances beyond his control. The divorce was nullified, and the remarried wife restored to his arms. One wonders how the second husband felt about it. Those who have made unwelcome discoveries far up the ancestral tree should study conditions in colonial times. The country was almost entirely rural, and a state of village morality prevailed. Diversions were almost non-existent. The daylight hours were devoted by most of the population to strenuous outdoor labor, and there was little to do in the short evenings except read the Bible and such other books as the good man's slender purse permitted him to buy. Youth demands a little recreation, and even such harmless country games as the young folk brought from England were frowned upon in the earlier days of New England by the Puritan elders as frivolous and likely to lead to immorality. Courtship was almost the only pastime left to the young people, and that they indulged in it hardly is evidenced by the court records of the period. Illegitimacy was frequent and occurred more often in a good class of families than it would today. There was little or no knowledge of birth control. In the 18th century, a custom known as bundling was prevalent in some parts of the country. To sit up courting of a winter evening meant burning out candles, and the box fitted with candles came to be known as a sparking box, or, if the young couple did not mind the dark, at least it entailed the burning of firewood, which had been laboriously cut, hauled, and stored. Fully clothed except for shoes, the young people found it more economical and quite as comfortable to court in the maiden's bed. This bundling perhaps led to no more premarital intercourse than courting in a hammock or in an automobile, and in judging such a custom, due consideration must be given to differences in external conditions. Alas, our colonial ancestors lacked most of the refinements which we have come to associate with civilized existence. They had their all too human weaknesses, but they also had their rugged virtues. They faced the conditions of life as they found them, and the fact that we ourselves exist is all the evidence we need that these ancestors of ours possessed more strength than weakness. But to harp alone on their virtues is to miss the minor strains which we must hear as well if we are to recreate a truly symphonic picture of their lives. Much that is splendid and inspiring is discovered in ancestral studies. If here I have touched on the less lovely aspects of the science, my purpose has been to console those who have found undesirable ancestors with the reflections that this is the common lot of mankind. Possibly one of the incidental functions of genealogical study is to chasten family pride and to make us more conscious of the essential unity of the great human family. And a quote ends the chapter with, "We are children of splendor and flame, of shuddering also and tears. Magnificent out of the dust we came, and abject from the spheres." Watson. So this concludes chapter 3 of Genealogy as a Pastime and Profession by Donald Lyons Jacobus, the chapter on family pride. Next week, we'll continue with chapter 4, Genealogical Byways. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you soon.